welcome. My name is Roderick. I'm the research director at the DGAP. Thank you for making it here in person, those of you who have, across a very rainy Berlin. And welcome to those online. DGAP, if you don't know us, was founded about 70 years ago at a time of massive upheaval and shifts in German foreign and security policy, and a time of bipolar global tensions. And we've established ourselves in the intervening years as a hub for discussion on German international posture, for public discussion, even on secretive questions of doctrine, and a place for identifying points of consensus within German society, trying to reinforce that consensus with international action. We've also, I hope, been a hub in those years where Germany's partners and allies can express their understanding of German policy and their expectations of it. I'm very glad that my colleague Valentin is sticking with that spirit in his work on Germany's cyber posture amidst great power politics. I'm very glad as well the EU ambassador and Admiral Rogers joined us this evening. We'll have a discussion with Allison, Pytlak, and Oberst Fraas. This is a field, I think, where Germany and the US face relatively similar challenges and threats, but have chosen rather different paths. Germany focusing on confidence building in the United Nations, the US looking rather more towards sort of some constant engagement with adversaries in cyberspace. What I hope we'll discuss this evening is how we can ensure that these two postures are not liable to each other and rather more mutually reinforcing. With that, I will hand over to you, Valentin. Thank you for organizing this. I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you for having me here. Actually, a couple of days before you asked me to come here and join you on the panel, I had a conversation with Camino Cavanaugh. Some of you might know her. She's also a cyber expert working on cyber norms. And we were having a conversation on how well we understand each other in cyberspace and what we actually need as, confidence building measures, even among partners. And we said, okay, why not have also a 1.5 track format among Americans and Germans? Because, 1.5 track is usually used for difficult partnerships where you think that you get further along in the conversation if you include civil society. But it's also, I think there is also a place for it in cyber diplomacy, because all of us approach this issue with a multi-stakeholder mindset. So we want to include private sector, civil society, and technical communities in the conversation. And so I'm very grateful that you bring us together today on this topic, at least among government people and think tank people. So I wanted to share 5 little or 6 little ideas with you to describe a little bit how I see Germany and the United States in cyberspace, our commonalities and differences. The first one concerns our bilateral relationship, which is very good. Couldn't be better, I would say. Of course, we have also things to discuss, and I will come to that later, but we have a lot of practice in consulting bilaterally, also in interagency format, so including not only among or with MFAs, Ministries of Foreign Affairs, but also with Ministry of Defense, Ministry of Interior, and other actors that are relevant in our German cyber architecture, and the same at the other side of the Atlantic. So bilaterally, we discover always a lot of commonalities. our differences are mostly in the field of how much regulation is needed and how much of it or how much of the minimum standards that we agree on can be on a voluntary basis. Otherwise, and that would be the second element that I would like to present to you is we find each other in a lot of like-minded formats. So smaller or bigger like-minded formats on norms. For example, we have one with almost 60 states, on deterrence in cyberspace with about 25 states, counter-ransomware initiative, another like-minded format of practitioners who want to combat this cybercrime threat of ransomware. There are 48 states in the moment. And both of us, the US and also us, we have this idea of that one of the tasks that we have is to broaden the tent, to bring other countries on board, to share our view and our mindset. And this becomes also more important as we see that after the Russian invasion to Ukraine, there is a certain division or cleavage in, for example, the UN membership. And when we look at the latest votes on cyber resolutions, we see that, for example, in the Sahel region, some countries are now voting with Russia and against our proposals. And this indicates that there is still a need for the US and Germany to spread the ideas of a free, open, and secure cyberspace for all. The third element is that I would say in the past 2 to 5 years, we have on both sides of the Atlantic experienced asymmetric or similar paths towards two basic elements of cyber governance. One is regulation. I mean, Germany, not Germany as nation state, but Germany as member of the European Union has adopted a lot of very relevant cybersecurity regulation, increasing the resilience of our cyber actors, both, for example, critical infrastructure, but also the competencies of the cybersecurity authorities. And the same has happened in the US, starting with an executive order of President Biden that was issued after the SolarWinds incidents and is now put into legislation piece by piece. And the other event or the other, let's say, development that is similar on both sides of the Atlantic is our discussions and how we use the instrument of attribution, so naming and shaming of cyber threat actors. It's something where the US has shown incredible leadership in using this instrument as an instrument to defend cyber norms. And we have been a little bit slower on this side of the Atlantic, but now we are really in all the cases where we attribute a breach of cyber norms to a threat actor, Germany is on board and is therefore part of an alliance to defend the cyber norms. The fourth, I would say, commonality I would like to mention is how we interpret the multi-stakeholderism. So our idea of shared responsibilities between government actors and non-governmental actors like private sector, civil society, academia, and also the technical communities. For example, I was in Kyoto at the Internet Governance Forum in October, together with also Ambassador Fick from the State Department, and we saw that there is a lot of pressure on this actually very well established format of multi-stakeholder internet governance. And we found each other also shoulder to shoulder in defending the current architecture, the architecture that we have, and pushing back against the attempts of revisionist and authoritarian regimes to take control over the internet in the hands of the government. So what we would like to see on both sides of the Atlantic is a shared responsibility between the different stakeholders who are responsible for a stable cyberspace. Now, I would like to mention also two elements where we find differences. The first one, and this is certainly something that Admiral Rogers is being or will hopefully elaborate a little bit on, is the issue of active defense. In Germany, this is an issue under discussion at the moment. After the invasion in Ukraine, this is our first use case of what cyber war could look like. It's very clear to all of us in Germany, in Europe, in NATO, that we have to step out our efforts to defend cyberspace. And this idea of intervening in foreign networks in order to push back foreign threat actors is something that sticks very much in the German debate, although we still have a lot of discussants who reject the idea of a Wild West cyberspace where everybody has the right to defend himself and use cyber weapons, if you like to call it like this. So it's an ongoing debate. I think it's very clear that we will end up with an improvement of the current situation, in Germany at least. So meaning that we create a better legal basis, perhaps also a more capable and competent actor to push back these kind of threats. But I think what will not be on the table, at least as I see it for the foreseeable future, is something like the forward defense that has been implemented in the US. And the second element where I think we go different ways is that in Germany we see the future of cybersecurity regulations, cyber resilience in the framework of EU or NATO. So our willingness to integrate our institutions, our capabilities, and our efforts into a bigger framework, European or NATO, is very big. So our appetite to do things on a purely national basis is not as relevant as this willingness to integrate. And when we look now at the upcoming challenges of what could be a deliverable for example, the NATO summit in Washington next year, I think our push for a better civil-military integration within NATO is something that is not encountered by the same willingness to go into this direction on the other side of the Atlantic. And this is definitely something where we have to step up our discussions and find a way to meet both our needs and interests. So that's how I would like to start off, to kick off our conversation.
Damen und Herren, guten Abend. Entschuldigen Sie mir, aber meine Deutsch ist nicht sehr gut. Ich werde auf English sprechen. So I went to a high school that was named after a town in Germany, and I studied German in Gymnasium for 6 years as a child growing up, because I found German culture and German language to be incredibly interesting. I really found German history very interesting. But apologize if I speak to you this evening in English, because my German is just not technical enough to talk on this. So let me share with you a few thoughts on cyber in the United States right now. So the Biden administration is almost 3 years old. It has had strong stability in its cyber leadership. Only one of the 3 key cyber leadership slots in our government has changed in the last 3 years, so there's been good stability. The Biden team publicly promulgated a new cyber strategy for the United States in March, so it's about 9 months old now. So we have a strategy in writing, if you will, that kind of lays out what the government approach is and what the approach is for cyber in the United States. And what I thought I would do is highlight 4 specific things within that kind of strategy at the moment. So the first is the United States is refining its views as to who should be responsible for cybersecurity. Historically, we believed it should be the user and the network operator that were both responsible for ensuring cybersecurity. In our new strategy, we talk about we're going to shift responsibility to those who own and operate the network and those who create the hardware and the software, that they should be responsible for security, not just individual users. Because one of the things we have found over time is we keep developing software and hardware that have fundamental flaws. And so we have come to the conclusion we must address that. So that would probably be item number 1, is the fact we are shifting our idea of who should be responsible. The second thing I would highlight is our government has gotten much more aggressive within our economy, within our nation, about cybersecurity enforcement. So in the business world, our Security and Exchange Commission, that's the part of the U.S. government that is responsible, if you will, for administering oversight of companies and how they actually execute their business functions. We have laid out a series of new cyber requirements now for businesses across America. We have added on new reporting requirements. Companies must now report to the government and must publicly acknowledge cyber activity in a way that historically that was not a requirement in the U.S. We have decided that one of the ways to increase the cybersecurity and cyber resilience of our nation is to be more open and to share more information about the nature of the cyber activity that is happening, that we need to talk more about this. The third area that I would highlight is we are starting to hold personally responsible cybersecurity professionals. And what I mean by that is our government has actually now taken to court 2 different CISOs, one from Uber and another from SolarWinds, where our government has said, look, as cybersecurity practitioners or professionals, you have a personal responsibility for ensuring cybersecurity. And not only will we hold your company liable when it fails to achieve a required level of cybersecurity, but we will hold you liable at a personal level. This is an issue of some angst within the cybersecurity community in the United States. We have a lot of CISOs, cyber information security officers, those officers in a company normally tasked with leading cyber security efforts. Lots of angst in their world right now about, so what does this mean for me as a practitioner? You know, am I going to be sued if I fail to uphold? And how is this defined? So we're working our way through that. And then lastly, it's interesting. One area where the United States so far has been very different from Germany or Europe, and not good or bad, just different, is we have been very reluctant to pass major laws around cybersecurity. We do not have a GDPR equivalent. We do not have a national law in the United States about data. We do not have a national law in the United States about cybersecurity writ large. Instead, this administration and its predecessors have opted to go largely through what we call executive orders. That's an administrative authority that is given to the president as leader of the executive branch that enables him or her to task the executive branch to do certain things. So you've seen us roll out a series of these executive orders. We just, as a matter of fact, announced a major one on artificial intelligence about a week ago. It's the last big one we just did. But we've kind of rolled out these new executive orders on cybersecurity. I highlight that to you because I wonder personally, how long is that going to work? They don't have the force of law. They don't come with any money. As a guy who used to be in the executive branch, I had to respond to those executive orders. I always used to complain, I would tell the White House, so you've given us lots of requirements with no money and no authority. So tell me how I'm supposed to execute this. So just speaking as Mike Rogers, as a private citizen, I just wonder how long this approach is going to work. In part, it's a reflection of our society as it always been reluctant for government to assume a large role with respect to the private sector. So we have resisted this historically, but I wonder if that's going to change. Like I said, the fact that the government is using its executive authorities to do more, I think, is a step along a journey where you're going to start to see the United States go down the legal road a little bit, as you have seen in the EU, as you have seen in other nations in Europe. I think we're going to go do the same thing. And then the last thing that I would highlight is with this administration and in our nation's cybersecurity strategy, there's a significant component, again, where we're a little different than some nations. There's a significant component of the strategy that talks about how can we use a broad range of capabilities from diplomacy, relationships with other nations, but also cyber capability itself. How can we go after those actors who are executing this cyber activity that concerns us? How do we stop those criminals? How do we stop nation state? How do we actually make it very difficult for them to do what they're doing? So that's a big component of the U.S. strategy that hadn't been quite so public. We had done it. I was part of those roles in my private life. Lastly, my experience in Germany, I clearly was a military individual. So my focus in cyber was largely military. But during my journey in cyber, because the rest of the government wasn't quite as technically advanced during my period, I found myself dealing with the president, dealing with foreign leaders around the world outside just the military. I got involved in cyber policy writ large for nation states. So every time I was in Germany, I normally wouldn't go to the foreign ministry, but I would go to the Ministry of Defense, the Ministry of the Interior. I'd spend time with BND and BSI, my execution counterparts about, hey, what are we going to do about cybersecurity? So I look forward to your questions and to our discussion.
The introductory words for the really setting up this evening by giving us a sense of they're coming now with the roundtable, and I just want to highlight a couple of points that I found interesting in your keynote, Dr. Grienberger, which is that Russia is looming very large in the things that you mentioned, whether it's by engaging with the global majority, which is reaching out towards countries which are beyond the usual like-minded countries. It's about also that the European vision, or also the American, that it's kind of a free and open, stable cyberspace resonates also there in other continents. And then also your priority about multi-stakeholderism and engaging also civil society more strongly, and think tanks, but also academia, and pushing that more strongly. And also in the challenges that you laid out, especially regarding active defense as well. I think Russia is also looming a bit in the back there, because one is at the receiving end of many cyber operations, and then the question is, what do you do, right? So this is a continuing discussion. Admiral Roderick, you focus mostly on domestic issues, which I found also very interesting, and how the US is getting a bit more state-led, let's say, whether it's by laws or not quite yet, but by also suing companies, by by increasing law enforcement or enforcement of cyber regulations. But I think also there's a lot of common challenges across the Atlantic as to, for example, who is responsible, right, for cybersecurity or cyber defense within the respective countries. So we're moving now to the roundtable, where we'll, in the first part, also focus on trying to get a better understanding. And maybe we can move here first to Oberst Fraas, who is sitting with us here also tonight. So my first question to you would be, in all the structural layers that we just saw, which is foreign ministries, but also intelligence agencies, but also agencies like the BSI, which is the cybersecurity agency here in Germany. What is the role of the Bundeswehr, and what role does it play also in cyber defense of Germany?
Thank you very much. At first, I should state that the German national cybersecurity strategy is very clear on segregating the three issues of military cyber defense, civilian cyber defense, and cyber foreign policy. So it has attributed military cyber defense to the Department of Defense, and that's what I'm speaking about now. And a second remark should be that our national security strategy, which is brand new, sir, it's about, 8 weeks old or so, for the very first time is very clear on talking about cyber and space and their relationship amongst each other. That is very new. It hardly talks about sea, air, and land, but it talks about the two operational domains, cyber and space, and how they are depending on one another. And that is very, very important for the military. There's no cyber without space, and there's no space without cyber. And the twins, those two digital twins, I may call it that, are responsible for ensuring the digital transformation and the operational opportunities for cyberspace. What is the Bundeswehr's role in cyber defense? It is clear that we are responsible for military cyber defense, but I would like to introduce you to a few issues that are currently being debated. The first issue is, what is the matter or the object to be defended? That is not clear. Is it critical infrastructure? Is it infrastructure that is necessary for the defense of Germany or for the defense of the alliance? There is no list of items to be defended. What is the takeover time from the Ministry of Interior to the Ministry of Defense? One thing is clear. War in this respect is easy if it is above the threshold of the use of force. We're talking about a time of defending against hybrid threats below the threshold of the use of force, and that is difficult. It doesn't make any sense to hand over the responsibility for military cyber defense above or at the threshold of the use of force. That would be easy. It must happen much below, much before, during the times when we defend against hybrid threats. But that time, that takeover time, has not been defined yet, and maybe there's reasons for that, to not let the opponent know when we do it and stuff. But we need to debate it, and that is very difficult. And who is the defender? The Air Force is, of course, responsible for defending German airspace, and they have the assets to do that and everything. But the German military, of course, does not have the assets to defend every company, every critical infrastructure, every power plant or whatever against cyber threats. So we are probably talking more about privileges of the military to direct, coordinate, and so forth. But that is also not defined as of yet. One thing is clear, that the counter strikes or the measures that are taken must be adequate and proportional. We cannot retaliate against attacks below the threshold of force using sea, air, or land forces, so it must remain amongst the means that are available below the threshold of the use of force. The Bundeswehr has taken part of the national Center for Cyber Defense, but that is just a process organization in Bonn where we have bundled up a few agencies, national agencies that are responsible or that have a stake in cyber defense, but it is more or less just a coordinating or information exchange agency. I think that should be good for now, and we talk about the Bundeswehr activities later.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'd actually like to pick on something you said on the threshold and being below the threshold. There's still a lot of questions to be asked there. When do you respond? How do you respond if there is no the threshold of the use of force or armed conflict is reached in cyberspace? Or there's a difference between the two. So how do you respond there? And I think the US has been there quite, let's say, acting in some respects already below kind of the threshold and trying to, or found a way of how to deal with below the threshold activities. And I'd like to make a broader point here and quote Christopher Coker, who's been a really eminent war philosopher. And he summed up U.S. foreign policy as saying that the message of U.S. foreign policy is don't mess with us. And so my question is to you is, does the message of don't mess with us also apply to cyberspace and especially to threat activities below the threshold of where you would usually respond? The question is to you.
Okay, does that work? Yeah, okay. So first, I would disagree with the basic premise that U.S. policy is don't mess with us. I would argue U.S. policy is obey the rules, obey the law, adhere to the norms of behavior. Can we work together collaboratively? If you fail to do that, then you should be held accountable for the choices you make. The exact argument we made with respect to the Russians in Ukraine, for example. With respect to cyber, look, our nation has publicly acknowledged, I directed the campaign, we used cyber aggressively, offensively against ISIS as part of the war on terrorism. It had some really interesting results from that work. We have subsequently also acknowledged that we have used cyber in response to Russian activity directed against our election infrastructure. So we try, as you heard from my Army counterpart, look, we believe that however cyber is applied, it must be done so within a legal framework that, just like every other aspect of conflict or the rules of warfare, must be proportional. You just can't overuse it, so to speak. And just because someone comes at you in cyber does not mean that the response is automatically back in cyber. You saw us do that with the way we responded to the way Sony was attacked by the North Korean, through cyber by the North Korean government in November of 2014. You've seen us do that a couple times since then. We are also very direct about, we believe that cyber also has both an offensive and a defensive dimension to it, that we think there is both a military and a civilian and a commercial dimension to it. They have different sets of laws, different sets of requirements. We govern them very differently. I was responsible through the President and the Secretary of Defense for our military capacities, both offensively and defensively in cyber. We were also tasked to defend critical infrastructure, and we defined critical infrastructure in writing in the U.S. We've designated 16 segments as being, quote, critical infrastructure. Critical infrastructure for us was, were it to be disrupted, significant loss of life or injury, significant economic impact to our nation, or impact in our national security. And so we identified, think about finance, think about aviation and transportation, think about energy. We put them in writing. And so as Cyber Command, I was the team I was a part of, we were responsible for partnering with organizations in the United States like the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security to try to defend critical infrastructure. So I spent lots of times as a military guy talking to banks in New York City or aviation control authorities around all civilians about, hey, how are we going to assist you? And it was assist. I would remind them, we don't own your network. We don't operate in your network. My knowledge of your network is what you share with us, but we'll work together. And so we've tried to be very proportional in cyber. While we acknowledge there is an offensive aspect to it, we also believe, which I agree strongly, look, there's a broader coalition and diplomatic dimension to this about how do we bring together a broader set of common views about cyber that hopefully we can create the same kinds of norms of behavior that we have observed in the other domains. Can we create those in cyber so that we can continue to function as a global economy, as a set of societies within this global community? Because look, the reality is we have created a world where we are now totally dependent on this massive connectivity, on this access to data at massive levels, and at this hyper interconnectivity. I mean, we are now automating remote access down to our washing machines and our refrigerators and our home heating systems, our automobiles. We're doubling down on this idea that remote connectivity, remote access, increased automation, increased functionality, greater reliance on software and automation. We literally, as a global community, are all doubling down on the idea that's a good thing. The flip side is we're creating structures that have more and more vulnerability in them. So we've got to figure out how do we get this increased functionality and the benefit that it gives us economically, socially, etc., with how do we make sure that we defend it so it can't be disrupted and the impact that has on our societies.
I would like to agree very much. I would say our main effort in military capability development is multi-domain operations or joint all-domain operations, and that is exactly the automation of processes from sensor to shooter, to have those chains automated, administered by machines, by artificial intelligence and stuff. And that, of course, also offers great vulnerabilities to the opponent, and to protect those processes. That is a great concern. But cyber is the nervous system of all those new processes. And that is, I would say, our main effort these days.
Absolutely. I'd like to move now to Allison, who has joined us online from Toronto, if I'm not mistaken. Something that's come up quite often in the conversation is about how to respond, and whether it's cyber diplomacy or also on the military side. And the 2023 cybersecurity strategy, U.S. strategy, notes that the U.S. is collaborating with allies and partners, strengthen norms and responsible state behavior, and to hold countries accountable. How do you implement accountability if let's say the attacker or the perpetrator is sitting on the other side of the planet, or a couple of thousand kilometers away, either in Moscow or in another capital? That's difficult. And even if you're sitting at the United Nations, you're maybe together in the same room with some of these countries. You might be sitting next to the letter R, then you sit next to Russia or next to another country. Then even there is difficult to implement accountability, right? Even at the United Nations. So I'm wondering, how do you see that the US is collaborating with partners to strengthen norms, and how does it hold countries accountable for responsible behavior?
Thank you. Great question. And thank you very much for inviting me to participate today. I'm sorry that I cannot be there in person. Actually, the reason why I couldn't make it in person is because I'm freshly returned from the Philippines, where I was participating in a workshop about US-ASEAN cyber cooperation. And so in pivoting to prepare for today, which is focused on a very different part of the world, I was nonetheless reflecting on the importance of cooperation and capacity building and diplomacy in this area. So Valentin, to your question about accountability, As you know, this is exactly what we've been focusing our research on at the Stimson Center over the last year or so. And we've been approaching that with, I think, some nuance, recognizing that it is in part a question of accountability as consequences for when commitments or when international law is violated, but also accountability to ensure that adequate measures are being taken to reduce cyber vulnerabilities and risk. And, this comes through quite clearly in the strategy, as you've noted yourself. There's a lot in there about this. And I've come over time to think that through our research that I think accountability is maybe 50% about building capacity and maybe 50% about political will. Maybe don't quote me on those numbers, but I feel like you do need a little bit of both to make it happen. So to your question about how the U.S. is working with partners to strengthen norms, this comes through in multiple parts of the strategy. The strategy is organized around 5 different pillars. The 5th pillar is probably the one that's most pertinent to cyber diplomacy efforts, coalition building, working with partners. Strategic objectives within that pillar is about the UN framework for responsible seed behavior and the norms and international law. I think a good example of how the U.S. is trying to affect this sort of in its real world practice is the Countering Ransomware Initiative, which was mentioned earlier today. It started in 2021 with just, I think, 30 countries coming on board. Now there's just under 50. And this initiative, it keeps evolving. It keeps introducing new mechanisms for information sharing, joint exercises, tools to aid in investigations, etc. And I think that per the release that was put out at the 3rd convening held just last month, supporters view the CRI as an opportunity to create long-term cooperative approaches and common understandings of accountability in cyberspace. And the release also is quite clear in saying that this is consistent with international law, as well as state actions that are embodied in the framework for responsible state behavior in cyberspace. But I think just maybe one other thing I want to throw into the mix a little bit, because whenever we talk about accountability, that other A word comes up, attribution. And I think that it's definitely a part of the conversation, maybe not the entirety of the conversation. It was also touched on earlier today. I think that, broadly speaking, the U.S. does have a longer history than some other countries or other parts of the world, perhaps, of making statements of attribution. And by this, I mean political attribution, which, of course, needs to rest on a solid technical and at times legal attribution as well. Under the previous U.S. strategy, attribution had a larger role in the actual document than it does in the current one. But I feel like this has also been sort of a tool in the belt that's being employed to foster more accountability.
Thank you, Allison. So what I get from you is that we've gotten better at accountability in the last few years. Would you say so? Are there more successes? Have we got more tools? Have we figured it out, kind of?
I don't know if we figured it out. I definitely feel that there are more tools. I also have observed that the word itself is being invoked more frequently, and maybe with greater nuance and by a wider diversity of actors as well, which, then sort of leads to different understandings of what exactly we're talking about. Is it private sector accountability? Is it state accountability? So on and so forth. But, it is becoming more commonly heard. And just earlier, 2 months ago, the UN Secretary General put out a call for an independent accountability mechanism. So it is, rising in priority and attention.
Thank you so much. Ambassador Grienberger, can you give us a sense of how the US and Germany are collaborating in cyberspace? You already gave some examples. I think now we talked also about accountability through the counter-ransomware initiative. Allison also mentioned, I think, the United Nations a couple of weeks ago. even last week, maybe there was the NATO conference at the Auswärtige Amt at the German Federal Foreign Office. Can you give us a flavor of how nuanced and how fleshed out that cooperation is between the two countries?
Our cooperation is very regular, so we meet often, both in bilateral formats, but also in multilateral formats where we have side events or consultations in the margins. And it's very detailed too. So we have the basic, pillars of cyber diplomacy, which we touch upon in every meeting, like threat assessment, response options, confidence building, norms building, and capacity building, and go through this agenda, basically over and over again, to keep us updated on developments in both systems. And because technology is developing very fast, we also have to speed up our reaction time, or to shorten our reaction time to these developments, which makes it also necessary, if we want to stay aligned on the major topics, to speak more frequently with each other. And this, I would say, there's also a colleague from the American Embassy here in Berlin, but I can say that this causes a lot of work, the foot soldiers of cyber diplomacy, because we have to organize a lot.
Thank you so much. As we are approaching the end of the roundtable, we'll soon move to the Q&A. But before we do that, I would like you to give an assessment of how the partnership could evolve in the future, and what other possibilities there would be to strengthen the partnership. And maybe we can start with you, Dr. Grienberger, and then move to Allison, and then go to Michael Roderick and Oberst. Fraas. So I think you already alluded to the introducing or the track point 5 dialogues as well. I thought that was a really nice idea.
Let me perhaps start with what I think are the topics for our conversation, or main focus of our conversations at the moment and in the immediate future. So the first one is, I think, cyber capacity building. That's really the talk of the town at the moment. We see that, this idea of our network is only as strong as its weakest link has become reality, also with the Russian invasion in Ukraine, because we see that we depend on each other, and that these kind of threats can easily spread from one place to another. And cyber capacity building is a good instrument, both for emergency support, but also for more long-term stabilize or increase of resilience. Another issue is the one of digital freedom and digital human rights. Something that gets there is increasingly more pressure on this. All of us have experienced an internet that is basically free and open and allows access to information all over the world. But this time could be over very soon. And if we want to protect this internet, this free, open, and secure internet, we have to do something about it. And this is also a major topic for our conversation. There is the Declaration for the Future of the Internet as an American initiative, which we joined. There is a Freedom Online Coalition as a format for states to exchange on this issue of freedom online. Germany had the chair in 2019. The US has the chair now this year. So I think also here we are fighting together for freedom online. And the third topic, because I see Allison here, and it was one of her fields of expertise in a former affiliation, is something where we could join forces with the US, and that is what we call the feminist foreign policy meets cyber. So we think that for a really safe, secure, free, open internet for all, we have to strengthen the role of women in shaping and governing cyberspace. And it's a new topic for us in Germany, and I would like to get into a more in-depth conversation with my American counterparts on this.
Thank you so much, Dr. Grienberger. I think this hands quite well over to you, Allison.
Thank you. Yeah, I would wholeheartedly agree with that, of course. In preparing for today, I was looking a little bit through some of the notes that I've taken at different of the UN open-ended working group sessions. And I noted that particularly, I think in the last session, there were many times where Germany made proposals on the floor for the text, and the American delegation came in support of those. So I think, that was like indicative of the sort of close cooperation that's already happening where there are areas of overlap and agreement. And I absolutely agree that I think it's important to keep working in those spaces. The UN is one forum, but there are multiple other coalitions and networks that bring the two countries together regularly that we've already talked about today. Definitely the human right dimension is increasingly under attack and one of concern, and there's pushback against that. And I think holding the line to remind that international human rights law applies to state conduct in the use of ICTs is an imperative. I also strongly agree with the ambassador around capacity building, which is fundamental to so many of the other activities that happen in this space. And I think that both Germany and the US are doing really well in rounding out the notion of capacity building to be, yes, technical, but also about legal capacity, political capacity, and so on and so forth. So maybe I'll stop there, but thank you.
Admiral. Look, I'm not a diplomat. I was a military guy, so I'll give you my opinion for what it's worth. The fundamental issue to me remains we do not have a global consensus on what are the right mechanisms for governance and control of this new man-made domain, much as we do in the others. We don't have it yet in this. I was just in Beijing last week, as a matter of fact, doing some work with the Chinese government, and this cyber came up with them. And they were just adamant, for example, look, we will exercise sovereignty over the cyber domain and the information within it, just like we do everything else in our nation. And no one's going to tell us that we can't do that. We should be able to control this just as we control our airspace, just as we control the waters and the airspace above us. Now, the counter argument, Germany and the United States, but wait a second. This is much more of a global good here that has achieved so much economic growth, that has educated and brought knowledge across the world at a level of capacity we have never seen before. I mean, it is amazing to me as individual.
It's actually more like air than airspace.
Well, I don't understand, but let me just finish and then you can chime in. Understand. Because we can't come to a broad agreement, we haven't been able to really crystallize legal definitions in a series of standards that we can all measure and assess against. And that's not a criticism of anybody. To my diplomatic teammates, I always used to tell them, you got it much worse than I do as a military guy here. I have a clearly defined mission. I know what capacity I have, and while it's a little nebulous compared to some things I've dealt with in my military career, I still felt comfortable. I knew enough. I had enough broad direction. I had the authority I needed, and I understood what the limits were and what we could and could not do. I felt very comfortable and said, okay, we can execute this. That doesn't exist otherwise. So that has hurt us. So we remain very fragmented in some ways in terms of the approach to this. Now, you hear lots of discussion, a little less now than you did a few years ago. You hear a lot of discussion about, so will this hyper-connected world that we've created, remember, this is man-made. We created this. will it fracture and splinter much as we've defined the world with a series of dotted lines around countries, for example? Is that going to happen? I sure hope it doesn't. I believe that the idea that this has been a global common good has really been a positive, that has really created much more connection, much more flow of information. I mean, we as individuals now, it is amazing to me. We have more access as individuals than any other time in human history. We have more information, more knowledge at our fingertips than anyone has ever enjoyed in the history of man. Think about what that has done for us. Think about how that has made our lives more productive, easier, enabled us to connect, share information, share insight, try to come to a consensus to deal with tough issues. Those are all really good things. I don't know, let me conclude by saying, I don't know what changes the dynamic. To me, the authoritarian states, like I said, I was just in Beijing and they were just adamant. And I just thought, oh, great. I've been talking about this with Russian and Chinese counterparts for 15 years, and I keep hearing the same thing. So it doesn't seem to have evolved much. We'll see. All we can do is keep trying. I do recognize that, look, the other point I would make, and I used to say this to my diplomatic teammates all the time in the United States, could we start small? Start small, build a consensus, and build it out over time. This idea that we're going to get, remember, there's, depending on what resource or source you want to use, is about 197 nations in the world right now. We are not going to get 150 to agree right now on a global approach to cyber. Could we start with some smaller subsets, build consensus, and then try to expand this to increase the pool of like-minded nations? Germany and the United States are a great partnership in this area. We are really well aligned. While we have some differences in execution, I would argue the way we conceptualize cyber is fairly consistent. We do have a little difference of opinion sometimes about, well, what should the role be of the United Nations versus the sovereign state versus others, but we broadly agree on, I think, the most important dimensions of cyber, which is why we've always had strong cooperation. It wasn't, well, in the United States, you never heard us saying, well, we're really suspicious of our German counterparts. We didn't. We thought we were very broadly aligned. And I thank my German teammates and the citizens of Germany for your willingness to do that. We've got to find common ground here.
Well, it's fascinating how countries are still grappling as to how to manage cyberspace. And it's just to say that it's not a new domain. It's existed since at least the 70s, and then more broadly 90s, I would say, also more internationally, but it's still countries themselves are grappling, and so it's really crucial, to keep on trying to understand each other in a small circle, but also in bigger circles at the United Nations. But handing over to you, Oberst Fraas, for your concluding remarks.
So I'll pick up your thoughts and take them into the mud zone of capability development. I will argue that by 2040 or 2045, we will have established multi-domain operations or joint all-domain operations. And those two thoughts are exactly utilizing your thoughts of the benefits of cyberspace. We are currently creating the nervous system that is lying behind MDO or JDO. And from a pure military perspective, I think one of the most important things we'll do in the future is that we will make this nervous system work within the alliance. What is necessary to do that? It is that we agree on certain standards, formats, and so forth. And of course, the American Joint Staff is the front runner in these issues. And we need to adhere to those thoughts. That is data-centric security, zero trust, certain thoughts on data governance, and so forth. If we don't make MDO and JDO safe and secure processes, they will not work. But we'll need those processes to utilize the opportunities of cyberspace that civil society, like you're saying, is enjoying. But we also want to enjoy that for military processes, to make the kill chain work better, to kill better and faster. And the second thought would be that we will need to protect certain civilian infrastructure better that has military implications. I just want to pick out one of those items, and that is, for example, our global navigation satellite systems that control the positioning, navigation, and time signals. I think that is dramatically underestimated what would happen if you hamper with those signals and those services. That is dramatically underestimated. Everybody thinks it's just for trucks and cell phones. No, if you hamper that, you will hamper our military processes, you will hamper our kill chains.
Thank you so much, Oberst Fraas, for the concluding words. So we sat together here to first get an understanding of what the two countries' positions are. And I would say that the commonalities are, of course, very, very much stronger, especially because there's already a strong footing there, because there's already a lot of collaboration. But I think what I've seen, at least tonight, is that their willingness to deepen collaboration between the two countries, and that there's a trust to do so. And they often, it's sometimes words or kind of an approach, or as Admiral Rogers has said it, differences in execution, that we sometimes don't understand each other, and that we just need to sit together more often. And I think that there's already have been some good recommendation as to how to do that, because there's already talks between the US and Germany on the state level, including civil society in there, and certain conversations would be a good way forward to extend that cooperation and to invite civil society to those talks between the countries. Something else that I want to mention is that differences and commonalities, they evolve over time. So the differences in commonality in 2015 were different than they are today. Both countries change, whether they change in their laws and regulations, as Mike Rogers said, that they are, the US is also being a bit more state-led, let's say, in cybersecurity as it used to be. And so in this way, it is coming a bit closer to Germany, but also the EU in handling cybersecurity. At the same time, also there's a debate in Germany about active cyber defense. It's called hackback, which is not the best term to use, whether that should be done, when it should be done, and who should do it. And even with that conversation, I would say, at least in Germany, in some ways, there's a similar conversation happening as in the United States. And we'll see how that will evolve in the future. Let's see if we'll hopefully meet up in a few years' time and see how the relationship has continued and hopefully also been strengthened. Let's turn now to the questions and also answers from the panel. If there are any burning questions also online, I can already see some, but if I would give the questions in the room a first mover advantage.
Hello, is it working?
And please introduce yourself, state your name, and then ask your question.
Hello, thank you so much to all the participants. It was a great panel. My name is Natalia Krapiva. I'm a tech legal counsel at Access Now. We are the digital rights organization that defend digital rights of civil society. And we just recently released our report on hacking of a prominent Russian independent media owner, Galina Timchenko, here in Berlin with Pegasus spyware in February. And this is something that we have been raising alarms about, as we suspect, as Germany is a non-user of the spyware, and there's also other states, EU states, that we suspect might be behind this. At the same time, we know that we've been a part of this discussions with the United States government to combat the proliferation of these types of spyware. United States has launched an executive order that bans spyware that hurts human rights and United States national security. They designated NSO Group and other spyware companies on the entity list, and they launched a joint initiative to combat commercial spyware with US, with UK, France, and other governments. And just last week, we were at the Paris Peace Forum with National Security Council officials at the higher level discussing this. But one thing I want to ask is, Jim surprisingly absent from these initiatives, and it's really surprising because we think that in the United States, from our conversations with the officials, think that Germany could play a very active and important role in combating the proliferation of commercial spyware, including that somebody was just hacked on German territory. So I wanted to ask, with German and US officials, how are you seeing your countries cooperating better on this important initiative to combat spyware proliferation?
Yeah, indeed, it's an important issue, and we have been absent until now, but we are still in discussions about this particular statement, and also how we could move on in actually not only giving a statement, but also controlling the use of commercial spyware, because this is at least where we have a focus on the actual operationalization of this ban or restrictions on commercial spyware. So it's not an issue that we would like to use it. It's more an issue about what can we actually do as Foreign Office, as Ministry of Interior, as other actors in Germany to implement the requests of the statement.
Good evening, Mr. Voucher. My name is Mr. Nana. I'm from the European Jewish Association here in Germany. And I would like to ask you about the cybersecurity. What will do the United States to protect the allies in the cybersecurity in the future? For example, what's happened in the Baltic states? It was 10 years ago, maybe something like that, that the Russian has attacked the central bank from Lithuania, Lithuania, and Estonia. I would like to know what will do also for Moldova. The United States will they give them the hardware to protect the cyber security, that they cannot bring propaganda from Russia, and what you will do for the allies, especially for Eastern Europe, Bulgaria and Romania and so on. Thank you very much.
Okay, let's take a question. We're in the back there, in the corner.
Good evening. I'm Jip Menne, First Secretary for Cyber and Economic Security of the Dutch Embassy. I heard Admiral Roger's statement on how we need to take small steps, and as part of the diplomatic community, I also do agree with that, and I think it's the only way to move forward. The only question I would have to the panel is, how do we combine this also with the "don't mess with us" narrative? And then I immediately, I especially mean, how do we signal that the open, free, and secure internet is something that we really stand for, especially to the countries that are known for offensive cyber programs against mainly the countries standing for that open, free, and secure internet? Thank you.
Okay. Right next to you.
Hi there. Thank you so much for your words. My name is Divya, and I'm a student at Stanford studying cybersecurity, but currently studying abroad in Germany, which has been a great experience. My question for you all is, what do you think is the number one thing that American cyber policy can learn from both European and German cyber policy in general, and vice versa? What is the number one thing that Germany hopes to learn from the US in terms of our current cyber policy and mindset?
Take one more. You should. You have a note.
Hi, my name is Alina Klaasen. I'm a tech journalist working for Euractiv. And my question would be, since you mentioned that there is a lack of consensus in terms of cybersecurity and what it means, the UN has currently going on the Cyber Crime Convention, and Germany also launched an international digital strategy in terms of setting standards in international forums, such as the UN. I was wondering, how is this the development in the US? Is there also a strategy going forward, or is this more a broader term of collaboration?
We have a number of questions. One on cybercrime. We have one on protecting allies, and kind of being deterrent, basically having a deterrence, which is difficult in cyberspace, and what each country would, number one would learn from each other. Any takers? Roderick, maybe about don't mess with us, or
so first on the crime piece. I mean, the challenge, I don't speak for the U.S. I'll give you my opinion. I'm not part of the government anymore. The challenge I think we always were trying to figure out is it's how do we align political will with capability? The UN is a reflection of political will, but it doesn't have capability. It's not a criticism. It's just the way the UN is structured. So from a U.S. perspective, we were often trying to figure out how can we align that political will, but actually make sure that we have actual capacity. It's one of the reasons why we've tended historically in the U.S. to focus on a coalition of like-minded nations. The argument being, hey, they actually have capabilities. We actually can do some things, whether it's extraditing criminals, whether it's taking action to try to remove these sanctuaries that many of these criminal groups have in Russia and Eastern Europe, etc. So that, sir, with respect to your first question about, look, we have in my previous life at Cyber Command, and they do it, they continue to do it now. You know, there was a military component to how we try to provide support to nations in Europe, to include several of the ones you mentioned. There's also a law enforcement and a civilian capacity component to this, because it's not a one size fits all. It's about how do we bring all of these together. We haven't talked about it yet, but I tell you, we can learn a lot. I would say both Germany and the United States, we can learn a lot. And to the question about, hey, what can we learn from others? There's a lot to be learned from what is going on in Ukraine and their ability to create a massive level of cyber resilience in the face of probably the most sustained attacks that any nation's had to deal with. And I would include my own, because we haven't had to deal with quite as much on the destructive or offensive side as they have in Ukraine. I think there's a lot that we can learn from that. It also goes to the question I see on Zoom. One of the reasons why Ukraine has been able to achieve such a significant level of cyber resilience is they pivoted to a very different model as to what was the role of government, what was the role of the private sector, what was the role of private citizens, not just within their own sovereign territory, but how can they expand this concept to external? So you've got American companies, for example, quite proud of the fact, look at Microsoft, Google, CrowdStrike, et cetera, just name a few, very proud and very public of the fact that, hey, we are providing real-time cybersecurity support and expertise to Ukraine on a 24/7 basis, working directly with both the private sector as well as the government in Ukraine. I think that's a really powerful model that we need to think about more broadly for the rest of us.
Thank you so much. Allison, we have not forgotten you. So is there anything that resonates with you? Is it about how are we showing that we're serious about, defending an open, stable, and secure cyberspace, about defending democracy? How do we become more serious on these issues, which may appear a bit more soft, let's say?
Yeah, well, I don't think it's that anyone is not serious about those issues. I actually was thinking a little bit about the question around the small step, and thinking that there are a lot of small steps being taken all the time. And to go back to the first question, which I know wasn't directed to the entirety of the panel about spyware, I think that's actually a great example because there are so many different, unilateral efforts. There have also been joint declarations around this. There's been investigative research. There's been all of these small steps to try to contain that problem. Yet I think maybe at times, because there are so many different things happening, they're not kind of all rowing together in one boat. And that makes it harder for accountability efforts on that particular issue. I was also just thinking a little bit about what we're just saying right now about the role of the private sector, also in the context of Ukraine and what it's done to bolster its cyber resilience. And I think that's a really important lesson learned. But we've also seen a bit on the flip side of that too, is that also introduces new challenges for international law and specifically international humanitarian law and protection for non-combatants. So I think there's different kinds of learnings that we can take from that.
Thank you, Allison. Ambassador Grienberger, would you like to take the question on cybercrime, perhaps?
Yeah. I mean, if I understood, you would like to know what is the outlook for this cybercrime convention. We didn't want this in the beginning. We saw a lot of ownership by Global South countries developing over the course of the negotiations. And I think this makes me confident that the number of governments and states who actually want this convention as a basis to combat cybercrime together is big enough to get this thing going. And we have reached a glass ceiling for the Budapest Convention, which was our alternative to joining forces in combating cybercrime. There is a glass ceiling because a lot of countries say, okay, we didn't negotiate this convention, so we cannot ratify it, although it's open for everybody. So I think that the global convention will step by step perhaps even replace the Budapest Convention. And of course, it's difficult negotiation with a lot of traps around definitions. And the big question here is also Russia, who originally pushed for the convention. Will they in the end ratify it, and will they implement it? Will they adhere to it? It will also answer the question of some of the Global South countries who wonder what is actually the Russian motive to sponsor this ad hoc committee negotiations. So I personally am confident that we reach a positive result, and I know that many, many countries want this too.
Actually fascinating how there's still negotiations happening at the UN, both on cybercrime issues and also on matters of international cybersecurity. So despite all the geopolitical confrontations, there's still talk, there's still a willingness to come to a common denominator on these issues. Oberst Fraas, we have had a question regarding lessons learned. And there was the mentioning of Ukraine as well, but I think something that really was strong in the German debate was the term Zeitenwende. And this is a term which means it's a turning point for Germany. So Russia's invasion or assault actually on Ukraine recently was a turning point for Germany, especially in defense, so depending on spending, but also in mentality. So there needs to be a change. And so the question is, what's a lesson learned? What does the Zeitenwende mean in cyberspace?
I'd say most of the time the term Zeitenwende by our chancellor is associated with those 100 billion euros. I would say that is not the number one answer. I think the number one answer is a change in the emotional attitude towards military issues, that it is a change of our mindset. It is that we are focusing to be able to confront peer opponents versus the opponents that we faced in international crisis management in the past 30 years. And I think one very important feature is that those peer opponents are able to tackle targets within Germany that those opponents from the past 30 years were not able to tackle. For example, our Galileo system, or certain computer centers, or certain power infrastructures. And but that is exactly what peer opponents would tackle to disable processes within Germany. But I do have to say that about 1/5 of that 100 billion euro package is attributed to the cyber IT portfolio, which makes about 20 billion euros. And of course, a large part of that will also be used to improve cybersecurity of the military's cyber IT infrastructure. For example, we will get new communication satellites, we'll get new computer centers, and so forth. And large parts are also used for cybersecurity. That is my answer.
Thank you so much. This is very illuminating, actually, because military systems are becoming more and more digitized. So the attack surface is growing, and this means that there needs to be also, especially investment in defense, in resilience, and to keep those systems operable.
And that is exactly multi-domain operations. That is exactly what we are doing with those $20 billion euros, that will improve the nervous system behind future automated processes, military processes. In clear words, improving the kill chain.
Thank you. We have the chance for last 1 or 2 questions. Does anyone else saw some here of Giro? And then we'll go over here.
This is working, yes. Giro Minier from the Deutsche Cybersicherheitsorganisation. Thank you very much for the robust transatlantic discussion. I'll try and pose a robust transatlantic question. Kind of building on what Dr. Weber sort of already noted, it feels like I think it's maybe fair to characterize the US and in particular the DoD's thinking on sort of basic operational principles in cyberspace as having evolved really significantly over the last few years. And so it's no longer enough to sort of react to incidents and to prepare for conflict, but there's a need to be sort of proactive. The name of the game is sort of persistent engagement, sort of hunting forward in allied networks, what Dr. Emily Goldman at Cyber Command has characterized as sort of, campaigning, right? Global campaigning in competition. And so it's sort of a question to both sides, I think. From the US perspective, of course, in a private capacity, what might the sort of US's expectations of its partners and allies like Germany be sort of under this new operational paradigm? Would the US want Germany, for example, to follow in the UK's footsteps and avow its own hunt forward operations in a few years' time? Or is there some other unique contribution? And then vice versa, what might Germany's role be sort of in this new US way of thinking?
Thank you, Giro. We have, actually we're already at 8 o'clock, so we'll have to wrap up here. So you have 1 sentence each, if you'd like so, to reply, or 2 sentences, but we're really already at 8 p.m., so please be short and concise in your answers. I think was the question first, maybe?
So, military perspective, yes, the U.S. feels very good about the strategy. That was one of the last things I did before I left. I signed that out because I believe strongly in it. I've been arguing we needed to shift our thinking on this. And we would argue to our friends and allies, look, there's a model here that we believe works. It's something we would love to do in partnership, but we also acknowledge every nation has to decide what's right for them. We're not going to impose that on others.
From my point of view, this discussion has to take place in the context of NATO. That is where we see the role of, military cyber defense.
Thank you so much, Allison. Okay, good. Okay, thank you so much for being with us, for weathering the 1.5 hours on dry ground, even if it might be raining outside. So you're good you chose a good spot to be here. Thank you so much for the good questions. Thank you for being with us for 90 minutes. We have some buffet outside, some warm food for everyone to warm up even more closely the relationship, transatlantic one. So please, let's move over, and thank you so much again to all the speakers. Thank you, Allison, for coming in from North America, for being with us, and thank you to Dr. Grienberger, Admiral Rogers, Oberst, Fraas, and we'll keep the conversation going. Thank you.